Hi, this is Shannon Regan. I'm the education coordinator for the Friends of GNFAC. Thanks for tuning in to this video that's part of Avalanche Fundamentals series. This video is going to be about avalanche risk management, and it's going to cover redefining risk in an avalanche context and some tools that can help you reduce risk in practice. So most simply, risk is the chance of loss, harm, or even gain. Think back to the first video, we showed you this chart about avalanche risk. Avalanche risk is a product of the objective hazard of avalanches and your exposure to that hazard and your vulnerability to the impact of avalanches. So when we think about risk we take in everyday life, I think one of the things that always stands out to me, and it may just be because I live in Montana and we drive everywhere and people get in car accidents all the time, is that we interact with risk every single day of our lives. In this case study, driving on icy roads, where our exposure factors are how fast am I going? How often am I driving? Am I driving at night? And our vulnerability factors look like what kind of car am I driving? What's my experience driving? And when we zoom out even a little bit more, the reality is most of us don't feel like we have a choice whether or not we need to drive. We usually have to drive to get to work. And so we can't drastically change our exposure to that hazard, but instead we can make a lot of choices about our vulnerability. And then we can do a lot of training. And typically the patterns we have from our experience driving, the training we've taken to drive, and our instincts serve us pretty well in that environment. And driving is really dangerous. Like statistically, it's a lot more dangerous than recreating in the backcountry. But I just want people to recognize we take all these steps to reduce that risk, both on personal individual level and on a governmental societal level. And so when we take that to a risk to a completely different context, like in the backcountry, most of us go out skiing and riding to make choices for ourselves. We don't have a license to recreate. We don't have to take courses to get that license. We don't have to pay for insurance. It's an unregulated environment, and that's why most of us go out there. But the mountains can also be a really low feedback environment. So this picture is of Saddle Peak in the Bridger Range. There's a large avalanche on one side of the picture, and then there's a bunch of tracks on the slope adjacent to the avalanche. Those tracks were put in after that avalanche. It's often not possible to know how close we are to triggering an avalanche. And we often mistake no feedback or no avalanche happening to mean we made good choices. And what we really want people to think about is the amount of uncertainty involved in recreating in avalanche terrain and in the mountains, and how we need to manage risk in that environment. And so when we think about avalanche risk, again, we want to think about, okay, what can we know? What can we control? We can know a lot about the hazard, but ultimately we can't change the hazard. We can make choices to influence our exposure and vulnerability. And you're like, oh man, if it was that easy, why are there so many accidents? So kind of the bottom line is when we ski and ride, we usually are seeking out terrain that's fun to be in. This is often avalanche terrain. So we're often not making choices that realistically reduce our exposure that much. If you play an avalanche terrain long enough, you're going to inevitably trigger an avalanche. So this picture is me skinning an avalanche debris of an avalanche that I'd triggered the day before I went back to the site to take a couple pictures. So I was not caught, buried, or injured in this accident, but I'd call it a free lesson, and I want to share that in hopes of some good learning takeaways. So here's another picture of the avalanche. This was just a little bit of info about it. This avalanche ran about 1,000 feet. The debris field that you can't see at the very bottom is about the size of 2 football fields. So this was definitely capable of injuring, burying, or killing me. I was on a vacation with my family, going out for a ski tour. It had snowed the day before. The avalanche danger was moderate. I had skied this slope several times before over previous years, was pretty familiar with the area. Um, and this was a wet, loose avalanche. And essentially, as I was skiing down the slope, the conditions drastically changed and the snow became wet and heavy feeling. And I noticed that, but did not make any changes in where I was skiing or didn't stop and reassess, and continued skiing, triggered this avalanche, was lucky enough to get off the slope. But I think what's important is to recognize, like, okay, knowing what I know and having the experience I have, why did I look past an obvious change in conditions? So when we think about the human factor, we all have biases, patterns from our own experiences. We have our own beliefs. We all follow shortcuts, and these don't always serve us that well in the mountains. So when we think more about what this human factor can look like in practice, the reflection I have from this accident is that I was biased to take that risk because of my past experiences skiing on this slope. And it was like I just wasn't thinking about what was going on in the snow that day or what could possibly happen. So the choices I made weren't really rooted in reality. They were rooted in my own beliefs or bias about what was going on. When we talk about human factors, it's really hard to make objective assessments because of our own experiences. You know, whether or not it's like we're out there and we're tired and hungry and cold and we don't want to stop and have a difficult conversation. Or maybe we're having a really good day out and we're just skiing on every slope, nothing's happening, like we're all feeling really good, you know, or the idea of like, I've been here before, nothing bad happened then, and we get really anchored in that, even if it's the conditions are different. You know, other examples is like watching other people ski or ride a slope. And remember back from Erica's video, if you have a persistent slab problem, some tracks on a slope aren't necessarily an indication of stability. So there's a bunch of other reasons that we end up making decisions that aren't really based in like the evidence that we're seeing. And, you know, we don't bring this up to be like, oh, humans are just like always going to make mistakes. I think it's more that we can recognize what we're up against, um, and then be able to build some systems around ourselves to help us, you know, reduce the consequences or limit the harm of the risk that we're taking. And it's like at the end of the day, like when I think about this accident, I chose to put my body on that slope and I still continue to ski and ride in avalanche terrain. In this accident, I was really confronted with like, oh, I didn't make decisions based off of evidence that I was seeing. And now I can, you know, continue skiing and correct that kind of behavior. And that's what we're going to talk about with this presentation is what we can learn from accidents and then how we as recreational skiers and riders can use processes to help us make more objective decisions. Because in this environment, we're not necessarily going to get feedback from the environment until we trigger an avalanche. And we're trying to prevent the worst of those consequences. So when we think about what factors we see in accidents, that we really think people can influence these factors to change outcomes. This is just going to be a bit of a tick list. Like we see lack of preparedness. So whether that's as simple as missing avalanche rescue gear or as complicated as like there wasn't good group communication. We see people who aren't really aware of the hazard, or how severe the hazard is. And that's from not checking a forecast, not seeing those obvious signs of instability, to underestimating the consequences of an avalanche on a slope. We see failure to recognize the terrain and really act. So it's not as simple as like somebody not recognizing that it's avalanche terrain. I think a lot of people can take a simple class like this or look at some videos and begin to recognize avalanche terrain, but it's more like how do we change how we're moving through the mountains in a way that reduces the exposure to avalanche hazard? How do we prevent multiple people from being on a slope at a time? And how do we, protect ourselves from like overestimating our ability to manage a hazard? So avalanches can often be really large. And I think often people feel a little bit more invincible than they should. So that's kind of the main factors we're seeing. And what we want to communicate is that for risk management, like we know we can see these patterns in past accidents, but the basics are really going to cover us most of the time. So if you've been to a Know Before You Go talk, you're probably familiar with some of these points. But what we're looking for is a process that's repeatable and scalable based on wherever you are in your backcountry experience that helps you manage risk for yourself and your group. Another way that this process can look, this image is from Avalanche Canada. I'll put the link in the video here for you to click on it and read it a little bit more. But essentially, we want to have a process to manage risk because, as my last couple of slides showed, humans can often make judgment errors or not be objective about their assessment of risk. And so we want to have a process to help us help guide us in the right direction and help reduce consequence and reduce risk wherever possible. So seriously, pros use processes and checklists. It's been well studied in other industries that take risk, like the aviation industry and in the medical industry, where checklists are really helpful even for highly trained professionals. You don't have to use, a specific checklist or a specific process. We just really want to impress on you that having some type of repeatable process helps manage kind of the human factor in the avalanche environment. So back to our process here, we're going to start by looking at what we can do before the trip. Due to the scope of this course, this is an avalanche awareness course, we're just going to do like a really basic overview of these components in the daily process. You're going to go way more in depth if you take a field-based course. There are other classes that go even more in depth into the planning and in-field risk management. So before you go, the essentials: checking your forecast, having a plan, and making sure you have the right gear. So this is the Gallatin National Forest Avalanche Center forecast. And from the forecast, you're going to get what's your avalanche problem, what are they seeing, what kind of avalanches are people seeing, how is the weather going to change the avalanche problem. We're also seeing what's the travel advice. So we're going to talk about that in the next slide, but how do we take the information in this forecast and actually make a plan to reduce risk? That's like the $1 million question. So when we look at the North American Public Danger Scale, and this is hyperlinked in all the forecasts, so you can read through it. We look at this travel advice, and we can make some pretty straightforward decisions before we go out the door just based off this travel advice. That's why it's there. So I circled the travel advice for considerable, and that says cautious route finding and conservative decision making essential. So a day like this, you may not trigger an avalanche on any steep slope you go on, but it's likely that a human will trigger an avalanche. So a day at high hazard makes it even a bit more straightforward. It says travel in avalanche terrain is not recommended. So most accidents are happening in the considerable to moderate zone because you're not going to see as many signs of instability until you trigger an avalanche. So before you go, take that forecast and develop a plan that's based on the conditions, the hazard, the group that you have. Even more important than that is like, can you put that plan down on a map and can you actually execute that plan? And really at this level, if you're trying to avoid avalanche terrain, can you do that with the tools that you have, whether it's digital mapping or with your ability to route find in the field. Because you can have the best plan in the world, but if you can't follow through with it, it's not going to be that helpful for you. So after all the planning's been done, you want to make sure you have the right gear with your crew. Really crucial for this is trailhead checks, and there's more on that in the Avalanche rescue gear video. So now we've done the prep before the trip. What are we doing to reduce the risk during a day out? So due to the scope of this course, we're really going to focus on two primary topics. One of them is having good travel habits. So we need to be able to recognize where avalanches happen so that we can use travel techniques effectively. And the biggest component that we want you to take away from this is that humans can make mistakes. And so we want to build in some room for error. What that looks like in practice, I have a couple slides with more information, but what that looks like in practice is reducing your exposure, especially when you're going uphill if you're on skis, or reducing your exposure if you're sledding and you're in a big group. So not posting up underneath slide paths, not having your whole group all bunched together in a place where an avalanche could happen. So here's a great example of that. This slope is off the Lulu Pass in Cook City. And this area, you see all the tracks. Like, I've seen tons of groups parked in this zone before. And we want to be asking ourselves, like, could this slope avalanche all the way to where I am? What's the worst that could happen here? So we really need to be able to recognize avalanche terrain to have these good travel habits. And these travel habits look like one at a time in avalanche terrain. And being able to have options if maps don't match what you're seeing in real life or the conditions are different. We want to have a plan, and then we want to be able to enact that plan and communicate effectively with our group. And I think the really important thing, back to being one at a time in avalanche terrain, is also like, are you in a position to effectively rescue somebody? So not just like, are we trying to limit the exposure of the whole group, but can we actually enact a rescue for this in this situation with this terrain, with this group? And those are some of the key travel habits that can really save people's lives. And at the end of the day, like, we're not going to be able to teach you everything you need to know in a lecture or in a single field day. And you're not going to be able to learn those good travel habits just off of one lecture. This is going to take years of practice. And this is just really the starting point. So the next topic we're going to focus on, just due to the scope of this course, is with conditions. We want to look for those obvious signs of instability to dial back our exposure to avalanche terrain. So what that's going to look like is you need to know unstable conditions when you see them. These are called red flags. And we use these as easy ways to dial back our exposure. So recent avalanches within the last 24, 48 hours. Cracking, collapsing, womping. So cracking and collapsing and womping are an avalanche without a steep enough slope to slide. And if you're seeing either of these red flags, it's a good indicator that the slopes adjacent to them are also unstable. If you have avalanche terrain adjacent to a fresh avalanche, it's probably pretty likely you'd trigger an avalanche if you went on that slope. Same with cracking, collapsing, and womping. So another red flag is lots of recent rain or snow. So really any amount of rain. And snow would be, you have one inch of snow an hour over a period of 6 hours, or you have 1 inch total water. That equals about, a foot of snow in 24 hours. So if you're seeing an awesome POW day like this, it's most likely like that recent snow is going to contribute to instability. So windblown snow, and this is going to look like you can see the wind actively transporting snow from one place to the next. So wind can transport snow 10 times faster than it can fall from the sky. The final kind of major red flag is rapid thawing. So when the surface snow starts feeling wet and you start seeing these little pinwheels, this is the precursor to a loose avalanche. So these are the major red flags. And essentially, we want to use these signs of instability as a time to dial back or reduce exposure. It doesn't mean your day is over. It just means you need to seek out terrain that's going to give you a bit more of a margin of error. So an example would be like, we have this rapid thaw happening on solar slopes. Okay, what's happening on the north facing or non-solar slopes? Is the snow still dry over there? Maybe we just need to find a different aspect or a different elevation. Or maybe we need to just dial it back and be on a less steep slope. Okay, so we've gone through kind of before the trip in our process, during the trip, now after the trip. How do we get better? When we think about this human factor, we really want to not mistake luck to be the same as good risk management. So it's really important to have self-reflection and group reflection about the choices you made and the processes you have. We really want to learn from our mistakes. And at the end of the day, we want to recognize that we're not going to be perfect all the time. And we want to just build in an extra buffer in case we make mistakes. So the goal is always going to be to ride another day. And we want you to manage risk with that goal in mind. And that all of this learning is going to take time. Risk management is a continuous process, and so is learning. It's a lifelong process. This course is really just scratching the surface. Taking a field day can help solidify some of the skills that were introduced in this series. It also gives you the opportunity to ask questions and be coached by knowledgeable instructors. There are a ton of different ways to learn. This course is really just one of them. We encourage you to check out avalanche.org or mtavalanche.com for those course providers and those local courses near you, and hope to see you out there in the field.